Hello and welcome to our web chat on the do's and don'ts of corporate treasury. Today our panel is made up of Caroline Stockmann, CEO of the ACT in the UK, who was previously CFO at the British Council and Save the Children Fund. Bas Rebel, Senior Director, Corporate Treasury Solutions at PwC in the Netherlands, and Bengt Elvinsson, who has 25 years experience in Treasury and is currently Interim Treasurer. Previously was Assistant Treasurer at Corning and MD of IBM International Operations in Dublin, Treasury Operations. We're going to be discussing three key questions in corporate treasury. The first one is very general. What is corporate treasury? Before we discuss the do's and don'ts. Caroline, you must have a view on this. What does your experience tell you?
We've been looking recently with our members and other stakeholders at our mission and vision and what is really the vision of treasurers globally. And big picture, we would say that corporate treasurers strategically balance risk and opportunity, financial risk and opportunity, to ensure that their organizations are successful and they create strong economies. So that's a very, very broad, big picture. We note that in different organizations, Treasury might do different things, but there are common strands. So some organizations won't invest, particularly because they won't have cash to invest, and therefore that might not be part of corporate treasury's remit. But when we look at, we have a competency framework, and when we look at that, we'll break things down into treasury operations, corporate financial management, risk management, etc. But it all comes under that major heading of balancing of risks and opportunities, looking externally and protecting the organization and taking opportunity as well. But we could go into the detail of the specific functions, of course, but that's the big picture.
Bengt, how do you add to that? What else would you say?
No, I would agree that that kind of vision and mission is in overall in the direction that most corps are going, to my knowledge. Clearly, you got the corporate finance aspects, and depending on the structure of the company, long-term funding, the investments, and in the company funding, etc. It will vary very much depending on what type of corporation you are. Are you multinational, well spread across the globe? You've got clearly much different issues than if you're a U.S. domestic company.
Bas, can you give us the PwC overview, the sort of 20,000-foot view of what Treasury is, because we're getting into a bit of detail here. What's the essence of Treasury for you?
We have a lot of discussions amongst the leadership in corporate treasury here at PwC on this topic, because it defines very much what we propose to our clients. If you zoom out, I believe that, and that's very close to what others have said, if you zoom out, it is about cash flow and it is about financial risk.
That's what Caroline said. She was saying that the risk is the driver.
Yeah, well, you can if you go to 50,000 foot, you probably would go say it is about risk, because liquidity or cash flow is also risk. But we would say it's more like financial risk, because you also have business risk, operational risk, and that's clearly not something that belongs to Treasury. So it is a little bit more specific than just risk. But the key here is that how companies are dealing with their cash flow and with that financial risk, that differs very much from company to company, as Bengt already alluded to. And that's the reason why we have developed that maturity model, where we link what is the scope of Treasury, what is the objective for Treasury, and also what is the budget for Treasury.
Caroline, in your discussions when you're trying to refocus what the ACT are doing, what is the clarification that you're bringing to this issue?
Clarification, we're really trying to get to the essence, the heart, and capture in a few words really what the heart of corporate treasury is. And that's where we come to, as I say, it's the strategic balancing of risk and opportunity. We have recently done some research, our annual research, the business of treasury, and we see corporate treasurers feel that they're becoming more and more strategic and more involved in the general business that they work in. And it's interesting, going back to what Bas was just saying, and also Bengt, because I believe very much that to be an excellent corporate treasurer, you really need to understand your business. So if you're talking about cash flow, how do you understand your cash flow if you don't intimately understand the ins and outs of your business? So you play a huge part. If you decide to stand back and just sit behind your spreadsheet and pull together a few figures, you're not really going to be a successful corporate treasurer. You're not going to add value to your business. But if you understand all the flows in and out, the way the business is working, what people are likely to do at any one moment, you could be an invaluable asset. And that then goes through the whole range of what you do. You make appropriate investments. You advise around your pension fund and insurance. You ensure that you have the right policies around FX and that you're operating against those. So just absolutely important. I think the clarification is understanding how effective you can be as a strategic business partner rather than perhaps maybe a few decades ago when you were less involved in the overall strategy of the business and maybe there was a disconnect. And I think that applies to a lot of technical functions in businesses nowadays. The same with treasury as with other functions. You need to be so close to the business to be effective.
And that's very useful background too. The two questions I posed in my article on CTMfile is, what should the Corporate Treasury Department do? Bengt, what are the things that you absolutely have to do in Treasury?
Clearly, corporate treasury is about cash liquidity and risk, right? Ensuring that the corporation has got liquidity where it needs it, when it needs it, on an ongoing basis. And when I say on an ongoing basis, it's that the maturity profile of your funding is aligned to the business profile of a corporation. Clearly, the foreign exchange risk aspects, etc., comes into managing that risk, ensuring that you don't get exposures that are unexpected from your business transactions.
Can I just interrupt here? Caroline introduced a very important thought, which is that she says that Treasury is going more strategic and less operational. So how do you do that?
And I think you do that from a different angles. I mean, and I think Caroline is right, because this issue existed 20 years ago more than it does today. I think most corporates today have realized that you need to integrate Treasury and be more strategic in what Treasury does. And the way to look at it, I think, is, where's the value add for Treasury versus what are just purely operational transactions? And most corporations today would have some type of shared service center. And there's no need for a corporate treasurer or the treasury function in overall to be involved in the day-to-day transactions of moving cash around. Their role should be more to look at where do you put your money, excess cash, how do you fund the corporation, how do you manage that risk? But once the transactions have been executed, the framework has been established, you can delegate a number of the day-to-day activities to the shared service center functions for executions.
Okay, and Bas, you have a slightly more focused view on this. Can you explain?
It ties back to that we also see that the opportunities for Treasury, just like Caroline and also Bengt is clearly identifying, the opportunities for Treasury are there and the framework for the profession is there. But what we do see from the benchmark data is that probably treasurers themselves in general are not as advanced as we sometimes might hope. The opportunity is there, but they do, for many different reasons, they are held back. The framework that ACT has created, which is excellent in my opinion, but I think it provides the opportunity, but it doesn't mean that, or it provides the vision, but it doesn't mean that all treasurers in all corporations or organizations addresses all the things that are on that framework. And that ties back to in what stage of their life cycle or what stage of their maturity the treasury function within a corporate is, and or what kind of maturity a corporation or organization requires from its treasury.
Caroline, you made the point about focus and working out what the contribution of treasury is. So how do you focus and get treasury departments to think about the real impact of what they're doing? Because this is what Bengt and Bas are doing, but you're doing it on a across a corporate treasury group?
I think, it is very interesting because it does depend, as Bas has just said, on the organisation. So, for instance, when I was working for many years with Unilever, and if I look at our competency framework and I go through the various areas that we would expect a competent treasurer to be, familiar in, then you would tick all the boxes really with the Unilever. Then other organisations would be at a different stage. So, Save the Children International, we were setting that up from scratch. So the first thing was setting up policy procedure and opening bank accounts. And then you start to get into liquidity management and more treasury operations, and then you start to get more into the corporate financial management areas, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, one size doesn't fit all. I think what we also encourage in the competency framework, and more to your point, is there are other aspects, senior professionals that are not just the technical. So an understanding of commercials, an understanding of business, and your behavioural skills, the way you communicate, the way you work with other people and collaborate, those are all hugely important, as are ethics and integrity and those kind of, perhaps we call them softer kinds of areas. And they're hugely important because they are what, in my experience, drive really excellent treasury professionals. I've worked with many of those, but I have also worked with treasurers who do sit behind their screen, don't interact with the organisation, and at the end of the day, they're not very good. So we would always be encouraging, through our competency framework, but through our events, through any thought leadership we're sharing, we would really emphasise the importance of those other skills to make you a rounded business professional that really understands the business and therefore can add value to it.
You've all been coming up against, and you've mentioned in different ways, is what should the Corporate Treasury Department not do? Now, Bas, you're quite eloquent on this, but what's the essence of the problem? Because I feel we've lost focus sometimes, as Caroline was pointing out.
Just before I get into not to do, I think I want to phrase the Chester cat in Alice in Wonderland. You need to know where you want to go, because if you don't know where to go, or you're just floating around, just like Caroline illustrated with one of the examples, if you don't have a vision on what you want to be in a few years' time, you don't know what to do right now to get there. And if you don't know where you want to go, well, then it doesn't matter where you go, because you will end up there anyway. So the idea here is that, yeah. The idea here is, if you want to get the full potential of Treasury for your organization, make sure that you have a vision, that you have a roadmap where you want to be, and that you are able to articulate what the benefits for the company is to get there. Because you have to convince people to work with you, to collaborate. You have to get them to do the things that you want them to do to make your life easier. And that ties back to what Caroline, the whole framework tells about. It's not only about the technical skills. It is also about the more softer skills. How do you collaborate? How do you apply diplomacy? That kind of things within the corporation. You need to convince others to work with you. Because in the end, what we believe, the strategic treasurer is the custodian of cash flow and risk within the company.
You are saying you need to be more strategic, you need to be more focused on the two main essences of corporate treasury. But there is a question like, should treasurers be involved in shared service centres? Should they be involved in payables and receivables? The operational stuff, as Caroline was saying, people hide behind the screen. What are the things they should not do? I'll come back to you, Bengt. What are the things that you feel they should not do?
They should not see the treasury function as a function with Chinese walls. They should ensure that they integrate into the corporation. The old style treasury was very much, we were operating in a silo. And that does not work. It has never really worked. You got away with it in the past, but today you need to be integrated. So you need to ensure that you are part of the development of a corporation. And with that, I also mean on the IT side, ERP systems, forecasting systems, and anything that impacts cash. If it's your procurement function, establishing contracts with suppliers, if it's a customer side, establishing terms and conditions with customers, ensuring that we have got the width And I'm talking about framework criteria here. I'm not talking about getting into the transactions, individual transactions, because I think Treasury needs to try to avoid being a transaction processing function. They need to be part of building the framework and controls and the metrics for the corporation across working capital, etc.
Bas, can you pick up on that point about not being the transaction-based treasury?
Yeah, he should not do it himself, but he should organize the process. And by that, give depth to his custodianship for cash flow and risk. He needs to organize it, just like Bengt, he or she, I must say, just like Bengt mentioned, he should organize the process and make sure that other people are doing the right things for the organization and do understand where the risk and why risk cash flow is so important to the company, and that the work that they are doing is important to manage that risk. So I believe that the strategic treasurer should collaborate with shared services, should collaborate with procurement and sales to understand what they agree with their counterparties, what that implies for the future cash flow and the risk that the company is onboarding. Collaborate with the management about the risks in the plans, in the business plans for the cash flow in the future.
Caroline, come back to the transaction-based treasurer, but what are the things that you prescribe saying, please don't do these, or try and get rid of these?
Well, one of the things I think my other colleagues have already touched on, but maybe just to draw it out a little bit more, we shouldn't be doing things that technology can do for us. So going back to the shared services point, we're seeing more and more automation. So in fact, what's happening in some of the research we've done on shared services centres recently shows that the treasury function in the shared service centre is actually developing higher level skills because they are using automation. So in fact, a lot of the transactional stuff in large organisations is being dealt with by technology. And therefore, even in the shared service centre where we might have the view, or we previously had the view that that's where all the kind of transactional stuff happens, it's actually they're getting upskilled and they're doing much more interesting work actually. So I would say what you shouldn't do is something that somebody else can do better or that technology can do for you. I think it's very difficult. I think if people get drawn into doing something that's not necessarily their skill set, that's a problem. But I would say all the things that we've mentioned today, all the things around cash management, investment, risk, etc. That's all valuable. And we talked about pensions and insurance. I think Bengt mentioned that early on. And we see treasurers are taking on those roles or those responsibilities more and more. Now, somebody might say, oh, well, why should they be doing that? That's not really core to their role. But actually, pensions and insurance, it's all about investment. And who would be more appropriate to be responsible for those areas than an experienced, competent treasurer? So I think things that are, I've read certain things that, people say, well, the treasurer is responsible for the financial numbers and this, that, and the other. I would say no, leave that to the accountants. I think it's maintaining that focus on the external world, the real world, working with the business to use expertise in all the areas we've talked about today. And I wouldn't rule out any of those areas, but I wouldn't bring in other stuff that's really not relevant to the role. Having said that, in a small organisation, sometimes you have to do a bit of everything. So you might be a CFO in a small organisation and you're actually the treasurer as well. And that means your role is going to be much broader on a smaller scale.
Coming back to that point about small departments, first I'll ask Bengt and then Bas. You have to be, as PwC, a jack of all trades when you've got so few staff. How do you manage that? Because you still focus on being strategic rather than operational wherever possible.
No, I think in one way, in smaller corporations, it's easier in the way that you're much more empowered, especially if you have the CFO, but also the treasurer. You get much more knowledge about the business in overall, etc. So I think on one side, it's easier. On the other side, it's harder to make the investments you need, that are needed for larger corporations, and having being part of the ERP developments, IT structures in overall, etc. And I think Bas earlier said the roadmap is important, and in a small corporation, it's
even
easy.
in a small corporation.
Yeah, I do think the roadmap is important, because I think, you take a small corporation today that 10 years from now has grown up and become a big boy or big lady, whatever way you call it. It's the foundation you're laying today that will help you drive your efficiency in the future. Look at how many corporations have got ERP systems that did not consider all the treasury requirements, or forecasting systems that ignore the treasury requirements. That whole, and Caroline said that you need to use technology to your advantage. And that's like the foundation of the house. If you get the foundation wrong, it will be much more costly, much harder to change it later on. That's the reason why you need to be upfront. You need to be part of strategic thinking when it comes down to what tools and systems, what technology solutions are we going to use in the future? How does our roadmap fit into a corporation's roadmap? And how do I get empowered to be part of that?
Bas, how would you comment on that?
Well, first of all, on Bengt, I agree, or your question to Bengt, I agree, you are a multinational corporation, and one client once said to me, we are not as big as the others, but we still, the only difference between us and them is not only the size, it's also the size of the budget. And that's the only difference. The issues are the same, but the solutions will be different because the budget is different. The need for a roadmap. I think everybody needs a roadmap, because the roadmap will define your priorities now, tomorrow, and the day thereafter. And it also gives you a storyline to explain why to others why the things that you're doing are so important. And going back to that citation that haunts us for more than a year now, the jack of all trades, what we meant by that was not that he will fail, but basically that he needs to have that focus, because otherwise he will fail. The vision, the roadmap, that is important to make sure that you will not fail.
What would be your comment on this discussion, Caroline?
Okay, well, just to round off what we just come to, really, I think, and this phrase, jack of all trades, I think more and more in professions such as my own accountancy, being a CFO for many years, and treasury, our remits are much broader. But I don't think that's a bad thing, because it allows you to be part of the business and really understand it, and probably have a much more enjoyable career at the end of the day.
Bengt, what would be your final comment?
I will look at treasury integrating into the corporation, being part of the corporation, not a standalone. And I think it's very important that that includes the technology developments within the corporation, that the treasury needs are actually considered up front, that you're building that roadmap out. And one piece that we haven't spoken that much about, which I think is very important, is actually the skill profile of individuals. And I also think we need to look at the new generations coming up.
Bas, what would be your final comment?
My take would be that there are different levels at which you can do treasury. You have to define what is best for your organization, even if it's not the same as it is today. And then it is about starting building bridges.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.